assess whether in fact the investment has made any difference or not. So,
yeah. Anyone else like to put anything else that maybe has come to mind about governance issues you've dealt with or identified? Yes.
Well, we just have a similar kind of approach in the panhandle in Okavango River Basin. Then we do have one community where there's serious human-wildlife conflict. There are various committees in the village. So we use an approach called FEM. This is a forum for integrated rural management. So you form such an institution which brings all committees in the village, whether farmers, conservationists, trusts, teachers, you bring them together and they are all represented, rural authorities in the village. And they form such a forum where all the issues regarding development in the village are being set and discussed. So that is called a FEM. Mm-hmm. So whoever comes with any other developmental program in the village has to go and bounce the issues at the FEM. Because the FEM has created a vision for the entire village in terms for the next 20 years. So whatever they have to be doing, they have to then be referred to the FEM, which will be able to give advice in terms of developments.
Good, thank you. Anyone else? Something to share? Yeah.
Yeah, I work with the with IUCN's Global Forest and Climate Change Program, and we have a number of projects funded through.
Thanks. I need the microphone because there's been too many good ideas talked about through the past few days. I guess along those lines, I mean, I think you're right. There are a number of tools out there, and the reason I'm here is because there are tools like ProForest tool from the bank and others. But I think what's innovative about this tool is how it brings together mapping, participatory mapping, and sort of governance frameworks. And for us, we have a number of projects with DMU and Dunedin and others in countries in Central Africa and Papua Indonesia and Guatemala, for example. And it's interesting to see a different approach and to see how it, if there's convergence or how different things come together. So it's interesting in that way.
Great. Anyone else? I don't want to cut anybody off. We've got time to think about this. All right. Well, I'll see if I can switch the slide here. So once we have this sort of inventory of governance groups done, and again, we've mentioned mapping a lot. I think you can do the level of mapping that you want to do with this process. For the most part, our pilots have just been sort of throwing flip charts up with a rough diagram of the area, looking at what's there and looking at who's acting in what areas. But you could certainly you could make that more, you could put more into that and work it into a GIS as well if that was something that was going to help you. But once we have that inventory done and we know who's out there and we have a pretty good idea of who the most important groups are for our conservation targets or the work we're doing, then we want to move into assessing the strengths and weaknesses. And with the hope that through the weaknesses we'll get an idea of what are the leverage points out there that we can begin to act upon to improve governance in a way that will improve the effectiveness of our governance systems in managing natural resources. As David was saying, there's a lot of different ways that we could have defined a model of governance for this. Lots of different levels of interaction. PACT, one of its specialties is governance, and I was able to engage with experts in governance in trying to find this. But ultimately what we settled on was a fairly simple, straightforward model that looks at three aspects of the groups that we're looking at. Legitimacy, how legitimate are they in terms of their governance, their capacity to govern, and then the power that they have. And work this into a bit of a model here. Legitimacy, capacity, and power towards effective interim governance, with some dotted lines towards power, because the governance experts will tell you that oftentimes power comes from capacity, or it comes from having resources available, or it comes from legitimacy, aspects of authority and things like that fall under legitimacy. So that's our sort of simplified model that we came up with. Again, we wanted a model that was accessible to people and relatively straightforward, but still something that we could sort of sink our teeth into as far as an assessment of the different governance groups that are involved. So our first contributor to governance was legitimacy. So the idea that stakeholders perceive that the governance group is governing in their interests, represents them, and does what they do. And this is another point where we'd like to get your input. In thinking about the places where you work, what is it that makes up a legitimate governance group? What does it need to do? What does it need to have? We originally thought we should have a very structured sort of look at this, and we should have attributes under this that were very specific. And what we discovered was that as soon as we took that out in the field, it didn't work very well, because people had their own ideas of or their own definitions of the attributes that went into being a legitimate group. And so I'd like to just take a couple minutes to have you all throw up some ideas of what makes up a legitimate governance group for natural resource management. What are some of the attributes of a legitimate group?
And also just tell us a little bit, we have this feeling that if a governance group is not perceived as legitimate, it will fail to govern effectively, because the rules that it makes and the actions it tries to take will not be perceived as legitimate. And therefore other stakeholders will basically deny them or reject their ideas. So we felt very strongly that legitimacy was a prerequisite for good governance, because if people don't think of you as legitimate, why should I pay attention to you? But we would like to get your feedback as to whether you think legitimacy is a critical element of good governance, and that if you're not perceived as being legitimate, does that by itself make it unlikely that in the long term you would be able to govern effectively? What do folks think? Yeah.
No, I think this, if I may say so, this begs the question. Because the day a group is elected to office, that is perceived as a legitimate group for governance. However, that very group then goes on to develop vested interests and aligns itself with coalitions which are inimical to the stakeholders. So this begs the question. What is perceived as perfectly legitimate on the morning of the 10th of, where are we, September, is not so legitimate by the time December comes around, or not perceived as equally legitimate.
And I think that's exactly right, and that's why again we were looking for some assessment that would allow you to track some of these issues over time.
Shall I repeat this?
It's okay, but just
It's
so
okay.
people in the back can hear, we need to use the microphone.
So elected, but also fair. Like they have to remain.
Well, there are other attributes, is
Yeah,
what you're saying.
the thing is, a governance group could be elected, could be nominated, could be a group of opinion makers, peer groups also. They could all have a hand in governance. The point I'm raising is that the day I elect somebody and I have a certain perception about that group or that coalition, that perception is likely to change over time, probably sooner than later, because that very coalition in whom I vested faith for stewardship is going to proceed to align itself with interests which are inimical to the stakeholders, and that's happening all the time.
Yeah.
But I think that's reinforcing the point that a group may start off by being perceived as being legitimate, but their legitimacy may change over time.
Yeah.
And if they become non-legitimate, again, it's unlikely that they'll be able to govern effectively. So, all right.
Back in the back, maybe first, and then we'll come up to you.
I think that last point has raised a question of accountability as well, and the link between legitimacy and accountability, and then durability of the legitimacy to accountability. So if the accountability system is strong, then the legitimacy might continue for a longer period of time. My my framing of this, of the answer to your original question of different systems of legitimacy come from experiences in my life where living in very different constructs in the Midwest in the United States, in Switzerland, and in Tanzania. And I would say, just to reflect, that I think the point that you were making about legitimacy being a social construct and therefore being embedded in the social construct in the situation is absolutely right. That what is deemed legitimate in the Midwest in the United States is not something that we can consider legitimate in a Swiss or Tanzanian context, and so forth. So it's very much a social construct that's embedded within the culture in which
Yeah,
we're
that's really true. Could I ask everyone to just introduce themselves briefly before you comment, so that everyone knows who we are? I think so, was someone up here had a question?
Okay, I'm Jennifer Mohammed Katawera. I'm with IUCN's Commission on Economics, Environment, Economic and Social Policy. I agree very much that legitimacy is a social construct, but I want to say it's also rooted very deeply in historical memory, social memory. And if we take, for example, park services in Southern and East Africa, they may have a degree of legitimacy today, given new governments, new approaches of working, but there's also that historical suspicion, given the gun-totting, expropriating type behaviours. And as the state and other NGOs and various other people get involved in relationships that are very patronising and extractive, there's always that suspicion that the relationship can change. So legitimacy is very much about a point in time set of relationships that's constantly changing and very closely related to trust as well.
Yeah, great. Good trust. Yep.
Anything else? Anyone else want to contribute something about legitimacy?
And I have to say that the legitimacy to us is this aggregate thing. There's a bunch of different elements that actually make you legitimate or not, and some of these we've just heard from trust. So if you don't trust the organization, they're unlikely to be perceived to be legitimate. If they're not accountable, they may not be perceived as being legitimate. If they don't have actual either the traditional authority or the formal authority, they may not be perceived as legitimate. So the nice thing about legitimate is this aggregate term that can be conjured differently in different places.
Yeah, David very nicely outlined what the aspects of legitimacy that we identified in our literature and our experience. The authority, the accountability. Authority is one thing, but being accountable also to your stakeholders. Allowing for participation, real active participation, seems to be an important part of legitimacy. And fairness as well. Being perceived that the decisions that you make, while they might not always be in my favor, I can at least recognize that they're fair. And these are the ones that we came up with that didn't necessarily work well out in the field. It was much better to sort of let people come up with their own definitions. Let's do the same thing with capacity, though. So if we're going to take apart capacity, the ability to manage natural resources sustainably, what sorts of attributes do you suppose are there? You can give us one word answers if you want.
Knowledge.
Knowledge, good. What else? Skills, okay. Tools, what kinds of tools, or is there another way of putting that maybe? Tools are fine. Resources. Yeah, resources, tools, things, physical things. You may need cars, you may need trails, you may need smartphones. What else? Infrastructure.
Power and authority to act.
Power and authority to act. those are good ones. We put those under legitimacy, because legitimacy, that's part of that power and authority. Those are very important. Capacity. What about people? Human. What's that?
Commitment.
Commitment.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's a good one. We have something very similar. What else?
Manpower.
Manpower. Money power. All right, so our process goes through sort of the definition of this, what capacity is, and then it gives people a chance to rate different groups in how strong are they in terms of knowledge and skills. What do they have in terms of human resources, in terms of financial resources? And it gives us a chance to identify maybe some of those leverage points for improving capacity. Oh, we just discussed. All right. So these are some of the things that we came up early on in the process: knowledge and skills, resources, a regulatory framework. We didn't really talk about that, and that may be one that we've sort of forced into this topic of capacity. But regulatory framework is really about having the laws, the institutions in place so that an entity can govern its natural resources, so that you can have that. Yes.
Does the regulatory framework, does that not relate to the legitimacy? And when we were talking of legitimacy, when we're talking about legitimacy, one element of that could be that the legitimacy, the authority fits within some kind of whatever, be it official government or other framework, the way people think about who's the right person to have authority.
Absolutely, yeah, no, absolutely. That could be an aspect of the regulatory framework that you want in place there. It's just a matter of where we sort of fit it in. Any other questions or comments on capacity? Yeah.
I just want to ask if there's a distinction, in fact, between commitment and capacity, because my perception is always you can be actually committed, but then you don't have the capacity to deliver. So it doesn't mean that they mean different things.
Yeah, so you'd want to look at those separately. And that's motivation, I think, gets it to some extent our idea of commitment there. But definitely, I'm motivated to do a lot of things, but.
Yes, okay. No skills. Absolutely no resources.
So, okay. So let's do the last one, power, which is a little different. Power, the level of influence a governance group has to affect sustainable natural resource management. For us, in terms of this assessment, we really looked at power as sort of relative. How strong is this group in relation to other groups that are active within the landscape? But also, as we began to do the pilots, we discovered that there was another aspect of power. There could be entities that have nothing to do with natural resources, but who have the ability or the power to trump any decisions that are made about natural resources within a landscape. So that was another aspect of power that we sort of discovered as we were moving along here. That's this idea of how easily someone might be able to countermand the decision of a governance group. And that could include other NRM governance groups or groups that are completely outside of that. Again, though, what sorts of experiences do you have with power? David gave a great example at the beginning where you had this new governance group exercising its power of sort of patrolling and controlling the resources under its control. It came up against the tour operator who'd been there for a long time, hired a new manager, and then sort of trumped their ability to do some of the things they should have done. And so these two entities came into conflict, and one was more powerful than the other to start with. And they eventually resolved that by doing some negotiations between the two and building a better understanding of what they were each trying to do. But what are some of the things that give a governance group power? Or what are some of your experiences in dealing with power and dealing with groups that maybe have it or don't have it, or don't have enough of it, or don't know how to use it. Yes?
I mean, the obvious points are...
Maybe who you are and where you're from?
Sure. The name is Khan Rashid. I'm from an NGO in Bangladesh called Roti. The thing about power is that it's rooted in either the political sort of relativity that organization commands, or its financial resources, or I mean, these are the things that constitute power. The kind of political mandate that you have or may not have, or whatever, or the amount of resources that you can come commandeer for a particular purpose. That will essentially give you the power to influence other governance bodies or whatever.
Right, great. Thank you. Anyone else? Comments about power? Observations?
Well, I'm going to say in Southern Africa, I think within the natural resource sector, within Southern Africa, within the natural resource sector, I think property rights matter a great deal in terms of power. So who owns and controls land, and your understanding of that ownership, what your entitlements and rights are related to that.
Right.